World War II was not only fought on battlefields, it was also fought inside factories. Behind every tank, aircraft, and warship was an enormous financial cost. Every soldier needed weapons, ammunition, transportation, food, and constant supplies. Money entered the industrial system and eventually came out as military power. The battlefield depended on factories just as much as it depended on soldiers. So, who had the economic power to win the greatest war in history? To understand that, we first need to return to the economic crisis of the 1930s. The Great Depression left millions unemployed and severely damaged economies around the world. Factories closed, production collapsed, and millions of workers lost their livelihoods. International trade also declined, making recovery even more difficult for many countries. In America, Roosevelt's government began using massive public programs to restart the economy. Germany also recovered rapidly, but much of its industrial expansion focused on rearmament. German factories were transformed into powerful engines of military production. But Germany had a serious weakness. It lacked many critical natural resources. Oil, rubber, and other strategic materials were becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. Japan faced a similar problem. Its industrial economy needed resources that Japan did not possess. Japanese factories were productive, but their resource supplies remained dangerously limited. Germany and Japan had strong industries, but neither possessed unlimited resources. World War II was therefore becoming a competition between entire economic systems. Governments needed enormous amounts of money to transform peaceful economies into war machines. One source was taxation, which transferred resources from citizens to the government. Governments collected money from millions of people to finance military spending. Another powerful tool was borrowing through government war bonds. Ordinary families could lend their savings to governments to help finance the war. Those borrowed savings were transformed into tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and other military supplies. Governments could also create money, increasing the funds available for wartime spending. But money itself could not produce a tank without steel, fuel, factories, and workers. A banknote only became military power after passing through the industrial system. The real challenge was connecting money, resources, factories, transportation, and soldiers. The countries that managed this process most efficiently gained a tremendous advantage. And no country demonstrated industrial scale more dramatically than the United States. American factories were converted from civilian production into enormous military production centers. Automobile assembly lines began producing trucks, engines, and military vehicles instead. Aircraft factories expanded rapidly, producing enormous numbers of military planes. Workers assembled engines and aircraft using standardized industrial processes. Thousands of military trucks could now be produced through highly efficient assembly lines. Tanks were no longer rare handmade machines. They became mass-produced industrial products. Ammunition factories produced shells and bullets on an enormous scale. Across America, huge industrial complexes operated almost like one giant military machine. The difference was simple. One factory could build one tank, another could build dozens. Mass production meant replacing battlefield losses became much easier. American factories eventually produced enormous numbers of aircraft for the Allied war effort. Warehouses filled with tanks, trucks, ammunition, food, and other military supplies. American workers were effectively producing the physical tools of modern warfare. But much of this production would not remain in America. It would be sent overseas. American weapons were loaded onto ships and sent toward Allied countries. Cargo ships departed American ports carrying enormous quantities of military equipment. Those ships carried everything from tanks and trucks to ammunition and food. American industrial strength was therefore reaching battlefields thousands of miles away. A factory worker in America could influence a battle happening on another continent. American officials coordinated enormous supply programs across the Allied coalition. One of the most important was the Lend-Lease program. America supplied trucks, tanks, aircraft, and equipment to countries fighting the Axis. Military vehicles were loaded onto ships and transported across dangerous oceans. Aircraft and other equipment were also supplied to Allied forces. Even food, fuel, ammunition, and raw materials were shipped overseas. The Soviet Union received enormous quantities of useful equipment and supplies. Meanwhile, Soviet factories were dismantled and moved away from advancing German forces. Entire trains carried machinery and industrial equipment towards safer regions. Workers then rebuilt factories thousands of kilometers from their original locations. Once rebuilt, these factories began producing weapons at extraordinary speed. American trucks became especially valuable for Soviet transportation and logistics. Supply trucks carried ammunition and equipment toward the front lines. The Allied economy was becoming a gigantic, interconnected supply network. America, Britain, and the Soviet Union each contributed different economic strengths. But how did this compare with the economic capabilities of the Axis powers? Germany had an extremely powerful military-industrial system, but it had major limitations. Its factories could produce advanced weapons, but resources were increasingly scarce. German tanks were powerful, yet they still depended on a steady supply of fuel. Without fuel, even the most advanced military truck was useless. German aircraft faced the same problem. Powerful machines still required enormous amounts of fuel. Germany also had another problem. It was fighting an increasingly wide war. Its forces were spread across multiple fronts and enormous distances. The German economy was being asked to support too many military demands simultaneously. German engineers could build sophisticated tanks, but the Allies could build many more. The war was becoming less about individual weapons and more about production capacity. Japan faced an even more fundamental economic problem: limited domestic resources. Its factories could produce advanced equipment, but raw materials remained scarce. Japanese leaders therefore looked toward resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia. Oil, rubber, minerals, and other materials became strategically important targets. Japan expanded militarily in an attempt to secure access to these resources. But this expansion brought Japan into direct conflict with the industrial giant across the Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor shocked America and caused enormous immediate destruction. But Pearl Harbor did not destroy America's industrial capacity to build new weapons. American factories continued producing ships, aircraft, vehicles, and ammunition. Japan could win individual battles, but America could continually replace its losses. The industrial gap between the two countries therefore became increasingly difficult to overcome. The Soviet Union faced another enormous challenge after Germany invaded in 1941. Industrial machinery was transported eastward while German forces advanced across Soviet territory. Workers unloaded heavy equipment and rebuilt entire production facilities. New Soviet factories quickly became major centers of wartime production. Tanks, such as the T-34, were produced in enormous quantities. Thousands of tanks eventually rolled from Soviet factories toward the battlefield. Soviet factories also produced huge quantities of artillery and ammunition. Millions of workers, including many women, contributed to the Soviet war economy. The entire Soviet economy had been reorganized around the demands of total war. But among all resources, one was particularly important: oil. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, and warships all depended on petroleum. Without fuel, modern mechanized warfare could barely function. Germany therefore pushed toward the oil-producing regions of the Caucasus. The oil fields around Baku were among the most strategically valuable resources in the region. German planners understood that controlling oil could dramatically strengthen their war effort. Japan also desperately needed access to Southeast Asian oil resources. But oil was useless unless it could be transported safely to factories and armies. German submarines therefore attempted to destroy Allied cargo ships crossing the Atlantic. Allied convoys fought to protect the supply ships carrying essential resources to Europe. The Atlantic became a massive battle over the survival of the Allied supply chain. Factories, ports, railways, ships, and battlefields were all parts of one logistical system. A tank produced in America still needed trains, ships, trucks, fuel, and workers before reaching combat. If one part of that supply chain failed, enormous amounts of military production could become useless. By the later stages of the war, Allied production continued expanding, while Axis resources became increasingly strained. The economic balance was steadily shifting toward the Allies. American industry, Soviet production, and British logistics formed a powerful combined war machine. Allied supply routes stretched across oceans, continents, railways, and battlefields. Meanwhile, Axis forces faced growing shortages of fuel. raw materials, ships, and transportation. German crews increasingly faced the terrifying problem of having tanks but not enough fuel. Japanese pilots also faced increasingly severe fuel shortages as the war continued. The longer the war lasted, the more difficult it became for the Axis to replace their losses. Time itself became an Allied weapon because their economic advantage kept growing. By 1945, much of Europe had been devastated by years of total war. Cities, factories, railways, bridges, and entire industrial regions had been destroyed. America emerged from the war with enormous industrial and financial strength. The Marshall Plan later helped rebuild European economies and strengthen post-war recovery. The war had revealed a fundamental truth. Factories, resources, money, and logistics could determine military power. World War II was ultimately sustained by economics, and the side that could produce, supply, and endure longer won. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more fascinating stories about history, economics, and the world around us.